Hello and welcome to today's session where we continue to look at Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. So in the first phase, when we started looking at this essay, we saw how this is seen as a daring document of the Renaissance England times, and how also Sidney tries to respond some of the allegations made against the genre of poetry and the kind of things that poetry does during those times. And this was primarily in response to the attack, the very vitriolic attack that Gosson had made against poetry in general. And this work, as we can see, this essay by Sidney, which is also seen as one of the representative works of those times and also seen as one of the earliest defenses of poetry, defenses of imaginative art forms, which emerged from and through native England tradition, we find that Sidney is trying to make a case for this genre of poetry and the many things associated with it. And this is also seen as an entry, a work which provides an entry, which enabled an entry into this discourse, which also necessitated the need to defend poetry as an art form, poetry as a discipline against the other contesting and rival disciplines such as history, for instance. And he is also writing at a point when poetry is seen as slightly inferior than the other art forms, than the other disciplines, and where Stephen Gosson's allegations also come to play a very significant role, where Stephen Gosson had already said that poetry is the mother of all lies, it's a nurse of abuse, and also that in alignment with what Plato said during the earlier classical times, that all poets should be banished from the republic, from the ideal state, from the ideal society. So this needs to be read in response to that, and also in a general sense as a defense of this genre, which begins to contribute not to just literary and imaginative art forms, but also to the general functioning and the general well-being of the society. So he begins with this anecdote about horsemanship, about his friend John Pietro Pugliano, and he tells us about the futility of theorization in certain contexts. And from there, beginning with such a sarcastic note and in a witty way that's very, very English too, he begins to enter this discussion. He begins to enter this discussion by first historically mapping the trajectory of the poet, how the poet was seen historically in Greece, how the poet was seen and situated within the book of the Bible. And he gives these very compelling examples of the earlier poets from the classical times and also from the book of the Bible, which almost seems like a hard to resist, a hard to contest case. So what Sidney does over here at the outset of his essay, especially in the first few passages, he's trying to locate poetry as a historical object. He's trying to show us that just like civilization went through many phases, many milestones, this is also one of the way in which civilization of humanity in general had been evolving, that poetry was there in everything, regardless of the discipline, regardless of the moral framework, regardless of the religious framework. Poetry was always there across all modern civilizations at various points of time. In one of the passages which we can see over here, he talks about the poet as someone who enables the creation, and where he translates the Greek word poen to make. And this is something we will find coming back to us in various forms later. When we had looked at Longinus, we also saw how the poet who imitates life is not seen as someone who merely imitates, but is seen as someone who invents something. There's a certain originality which is attributed to this act of imitation. So we find Sidney also drawing upon all these big names from the classical times, and he is also trying to situate the function of poetry, the nature of poetry within that intellectual trajectory. He also highlights the significance of nature in producing poetry, the significance of nature in enabling this imitation. So we begin by looking at in today's lecture, we begin by looking at this certain kind of an equation that he puts together. Here I read to you from this passage. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigour of his own invention, doth grow in effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite new, forms such as never were in nature, as a heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as he goeth hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit. Here we find a peculiar kind of equation at work when he's talking about this imaginative faculty that the poet possesses. And here we find that he is trying to say that invention, which is also an extension of imitation, invention along with wit, it produces imagination. And this is another way in which, this is one of the native ways in which we find the English critic beginning to talk about the idea of imagination. And as noted before, in the earlier classical Greek and Roman tradition, there was no particular word assigned to talk about the quality of imagination. Of course, we find imagination being invoked in various ways, but imagination per se, the word per se, was never mentioned. And we find that it becomes one of the key ways in which criticism begins to engage with literature. And with the Romantic times, with the Romantic criticism, we also find that imagination becomes the most central cornerstone in defining this art form itself. So here, Sidney is trying to tell us that the poet is capable of making, the poet is capable of not just imitating, but making another world altogether. And this he does with his capacity to invent, his capacity for originality, combined with his wit or genius, and that results in a proper kind of an imagination. Here he is even going to another level of elevating poetry slightly better than nature itself. And he, as the Greek masters also at some point believed in, he also reiterates this point that the poet is perhaps capable of making the world better. As he puts it, her world is brazen. He talks about nature. Nature's world is brazen. The poets only deliver a golden. So the poet becomes situated at a slightly different stature, slightly better stature than what nature has itself. So the poet not only imitates, he also delivers it in a more ornamented, more decorated form. Nature becomes something else in the hands of this poet, who has this ability to transform what he sees into something infinitely better. And that infinitely better thing also has the power to transform the individual and the society as well. And that's something that the ethical framework of literary criticism from the earliest English times onwards, they continue to emphasize on. Sidney gives a few examples in the next passage to prove his point. And then he begins to focus significantly, very pointedly, on Aristotle himself. Poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end to teach and delight. Sidney and many others during his time, they believed in the power of literature to teach and to delight. And herein we find the ethical framework, the moral framework within which criticism continues to be rooted in the earlier English critical world. So we also find that that's also an extension of the liberal humanist approach, the Aristotelian humanism getting enacted upon what later became the foundations of native English critical tradition. And he talks about three different kinds of imitation. Of this have been three several kinds, and here we find Sidney also employing the Aristotelian method of looking at poetry, looking at this imaginative art form with a clinical detachment and using a scientific process to go through it. And when he is identifying this keenness that Sidney shows in compartmentalizing and in ordering things, it also reflects the scientific bent of mind that the critic in him had. Of this have been three several kinds, the chief both in antiquity and excellency, where they that did imitate the inconceivable excellencies of God. So that's a first kind of imitation that Sidney begins to talk about, something that is inherent, that is situated within the religious framework, whatever art form, whatever imitation which imitated the inconceivable excellencies of God. There are a lot of examples that he gives over here. David's Psalms, Solomon's Song of Songs, and also Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, Moses and Deborah and their hymns, the writer of Job. And he also gives other examples. Here we find him drawing upon the principles that he had perhaps got by reading Horace or from Aristotle's Poetics, and he is talking about, he is using this scientific approach, this clinically precise way to talk about literary criticism. And he gives extensive examples over here from different traditions, from the divine tradition, from the Christian tradition, from the Greek and Roman literature, which also makes it, as mentioned before, makes this case a hard to refute, a hard to resist case. And secondly, he says the second is of them that deal with matters philosophical, either moral or astronomical or historical. So the first is a divine framework, predominantly religious framework. The second is a philosophical framework. And this is a kind of categorization, the various kinds of differentiations that he gives to imitation. He goes a few steps further than perhaps Aristotle himself in classifying the kinds of imitations, the different methods through which, the different media through which imitation can also work when it comes to any imaginative art form. He continues to give examples, and if we look at Sidney's Apology for Poetry in its entirety, it's very scholarly. We find the scholar in Sidney sometimes overtaking the critic in him, and this entire work is littered with a lot of classical references, a lot of contemporary references, and you would also realize that if one were to undertake a very close reading of this work, you would need an astronomical amount of information about the classical period, about the kind of works which were produced then, the kind of works that the English people were producing during those times, and also some other references from French and Spanish traditions as well. From that, he moves on to the third kind of imitation. It's within this that he tries to situate the poet. For these third be they which most properly do imitate, to teach and delight, and to imitate borrow nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be, but range, only range with learned discretion into the divine considerations of what may be and should be. And it's at this point, when he is beginning to talk about the poet and the poet and this art form poetry, that he begins to talk about the functions of a poet as well. So what do? Unlike the first two types that one spoke about, which where the objectives were primarily to teach, to instruct, to ensure that there is a proper religious philosophical framework within which human behavior is conditioned. Unlike that, in the third category of imitation within which he locates the poet too, the function over here is to imitate, both to delight and teach, and delight to move men to take that goodness in hand, which without delight they would fly as from a stranger. So what is this additional quality that this poet brings in, that poetry gives to the first two dimensions? This added quality is delight, the ability to delight. So across various religious frameworks, across various philosophical frameworks from time immemorial, delight or pleasure was always seen as something inferior compared to wisdom, compared to teaching. So in all moral and social fabrics, in all kinds of understandings about human behavior, pleasure was never seen as something inherently good. So here we find the critical tradition taking a different turn altogether, and taking off, of course, from some of the classical writers and emphasizing this twin quality of teaching and delight. And here he also puts it very poignantly, very succinctly, that if had it not been for the quality of delight, people would have fled from that, because what gives this added flavor to the quality of poetry, to the function of a poet, is this ability to delight. And he continues to say, and teach to make them know that goodness whereunto they are moved, which being the noblest scope to whichever any learning was directed, yet want there are not idle tongues to bark at them. And he also encourages us to look at the subdivisions of poetry, the heroic, lyric, tragic, comic, satiric, iambic, elegiac, pastoral, and certain others. And while talking about these different categories, he also tries to privilege content over form. This is when he says, it is not rhyming and versing that maketh a poet. He is also daring to say something very significantly different over here, which is why this document is also known as, it has been mentioned as one of the most daring documents produced in Renaissance England, especially within the field of literature. He is bold enough to say that it's not really about the rhyming scheme, it's not really about versing which maketh a poet. And then he goes on to make this comparison with the discipline of history, with the historian, which we would come to in a while. But it is that feigning notable images of virtues, vices, or what else, with their delightful teaching, which must be the right describing note to know a poet by. A poet is not known, a poet is not identified by the form within which he works. The identification of poetry, the hallmark of poetry, Sidney tells us at this point of time that it's not about whether it's going to rhyme or not. It's not about the versification scheme at all. It's about something else. It's about this power to delight. It's about this ability to offer delightful teaching. We continue to see over here that there is a certain way in which Neoplatonic as well as Aristotelian humanist tendencies come to work over here almost simultaneously. But the emphasis on delight, that is something very, very significant, and it also becomes something like a turning point in the history of literary criticism, in the history of the ways in which we are even taught to look at literature or any kind of imaginative art form. And from this point onwards, and what Sidney does is he is categorically trying to elevate poetry to a different realm altogether. It's not just about learning, it's about an elevated, a higher kind of learning, which also involves delight, and it has all kinds of persuasive arguments in place to ensure that people do not flee from this kind of teaching. On the other hand, they are drawn to this sort of teaching because it also involves delight, it also involves pleasure. This purifying of wit, this entrenching of memory, enabling of judgment, and enlarging of conceit, which commonly we call learning. Look at the various phrases that he uses to talk about this new kind of learning which comes along with delight, to teach and to delight. The final end is to lead and draw us to as higher perfection as our degenerate souls, made worse by their clayey lodgings, can be capable of. So there's a perfection that human soul also achieves along with this. It's very Neoplatonic in that sense too. It's very Neoplatonic. We say Neoplatonic to indicate that it also talks about the elevation of souls. It also talks about the purification of souls, about the capacity of art, about the capacity of poetry to edify the human soul and by extension work towards the healthy functioning of a society. And he ends the discussion with this almost conclusive statement. So that the ending end, which means the supreme end, the final end, the end of all earthly learning being virtuous action, those skills that most serve to being forth, that have a most just title to be princes all over the rest, wherein if we can show the poet is worthy to have it before any other competitors. So it is about, and he almost takes us to a point where he is able to convince his audience that poetry is also about learning virtuous things. And this is something, this kind of learning also happens along with delight. And this delight, this kind of pleasure need not be looked down upon. On the other hand, it needs to be seen as at an elevated state. It needs to be situated in a more elevated state as compared to religious learning or philosophical learning. The comparisons that he draws over here in terms of the poet, in terms of poetry, it happens in two ways. Therefore, compare we the poet with the historian and with the moral philosopher. So this sort of comparison also helps in this battle of disciplines, because we are also going through a time, and Sidney is also writing during a time when there's a lot of discussion about which discipline or which art form is more superior to the other. So there is this hierarchy of disciplines, there's this hierarchy of different kinds of knowledges, and Sidney is trying to position the poet, position the art form poetry as a worthy competitor. And instead of looking down upon poetry, he also encourages others to see it at par with any other discipline where the poet or the art form poetry can compete with others in terms of function, in terms of its delivery, in terms of the techniques which are involved. In the following passage he says, the philosopher therefore and the historian are they which would win the goal, the one by precept, the other by example. So he is telling us in greater detail about what the philosopher does, what the historian does, so that he can properly situate what the poet does too. And what does he say? The peerless poet performs both. So he is comparing, on the one hand, he is trying to compare the poet with the philosopher and the historian, and then continually we can find that in these all of these passages he's trying to prove how the poet is far superior to a philosopher or a historian. And he talks about how the poet is the only one who is capable of giving a perfect picture. And this continuous reference to the poet giving a perfect picture. He talks about perfect picture over here and then the picture of poesy. This we find it's also in continuation with the classical tradition. If you remember the discussions on poetics, he gives a lot of examples from history as well as from painting, and that is also one of the ways in which we learn how to simulate one form over the other when it comes to applying yardsticks, when it comes to formulating different evaluating principles. And at the right moment, he also brings in Aristotle again when he states, truly Aristotle himself in his discourse of poesy plainly determined this question, saying that poetry is philosopheteron and spudiatron, that is to say, it is more philosophical and more studiously serious than history. His reason is because poesy deals with the universal and history with the particular. And look at the way in which the argument is being built over here. Poetry is dealing with the universal, which is again an extension of the many discussions that Aristotle also tried to invoke in his humanistic approach about the universality of poetry, the universality of any imaginative art form, which also makes it hard to contest. So here Sidney again reiterates that poetry deals with universal things while history deals with particular things. Here, as mentioned before, he's going a few steps ahead in not just justifying poetry but also elevating it to a more superior status than philosophy or history. Sidney continues to make a very extensive case for the poet, arguing that he needs to be placed at a higher status compared to the philosopher and historian. And here he states, by these therefore examples and reasons, I think it may be manifest that the poet with that same hand of delight doth draw the mind more effectually than any other art doth. So he gives a lot of examples. You might at some point find that it also becomes very tiring to follow through these examples from various traditions, from religion, from Christianity in particular, from the Greek and Roman classics. And there are a lot of examples, there are a lot of references that this text is almost littered with. You may find it quite exhausting to go through those lists, but we find that the compelling point that he tries to make is whether you are trying to take the trajectory of religion or the trajectory of philosophy or history, whichever way you go, there's no way in which one can refute the fact that the poet is certainly superior to other artists and other art forms. And at this point, he also begins to respond to the allegations that Gaussen had made. He does not mention the name Gaussen. He does not even refer to the work School of Abuse that Stephen Gaussen had produced, but he makes this statement over here. To the argument of abuse, I will answer after, which also tells us that at some level, at various levels, in fact, Sidney's line of defense is in response to the line of attack that Gaussen had in his work. And every now and then, if you look at the structure of this work, it is not divided into different sections, but every now and then he also does a summing up. There is a way in which he does a recap over here, like you can find over here. Since then poetry is of all human learnings the most ancient and most fatherly antiquity, as from whence other learnings have taken their beginning, since it is so universal that no learned nation doth despise it, nor no barbarous nation is without it, since both Roman and Greek gave divine names unto it, the one of prophesying, the other of making, and that indeed that name of making is fit for him, considering that whereas other arts retain themselves within their subject and receive it, as it were, their being from it, the poet only bringeth his own stuff, and doth not learn a conceit out of a matter, but maketh matter for a conceit, since neither his description nor his end containeth any evil. The thing described cannot be evil, since his effects be so good as to teach goodness and delight the learners of it. Since therein, namely in moral doctrine, the chief of all knowledges, he doth not only far pass the historian, but for instructing is well nigh comparable to the philosopher. and for moving leaveth him behind, since the Holy Scripture hath whole parts in it poetical, and that even our Saviour Christ vouchsafed to use the flowers of it, since all his kinds are not only in their united forms, but in their several dissections fully commendable. I think rightly, the laurel crown appointed for triumphing captains doth worthily of all other learnings honour the poet's triumph. This is a paragraph, a long sentence. As you can see, it also tells us about the kind of language and diction which was used during that time. And more than that, there's a summing up he does over here, where he states what he had been trying to do in these last few passages, trying to situate the poet from various angles, and how he proves that if in the annals of history, religion and philosophy, if the trajectory of the poet is laid out so clearly, identifying him as the prophet, the maker, and someone who produces delight even while he is teaching, then there's no way in which the poet can be discarded. There's no way in which poetry can be degraded. And he also uses this very compelling reference of Jesus Christ himself, because he also knows that that will address the audience who were already convinced by Stephen Gosson, who also was a Puritan. And there's a term that he uses right after that, and he also responding to some of the tendencies of his times, poet haters, and he's also addressing them and telling them a few things to deal with the kind of attack that Stephen Gosson had launched against poetry and poets in particular. So with this, we also wrap up this session. In the next session, we shall be looking at how Sidney places his line of argument within a native English critical tradition, and how in that process he's also generating something which is not there already by making this very extensive argument in favor of poetry, in favor of poets, and by comparing the art of poetry with the other disciplines. He's also trying to generate a native critical tradition on which we will find that the rest of English criticism is also based upon. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.